Let me begin our proceedings with an acknowledgement of country. Sovereign Hill acknowledges the Wathaurong people as the traditional owners of the land on which we operate. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to all of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who live and work on Wathaurong country. We acknowledge their unceded sovereignty over Wathaurong country and the ongoing hardship and trauma as a result of colonisation. The history and continuous culture of the Wathaurong people is an important part of our shared story. And I realise that members of our audience will of course be taking part in the lecture tonight from right across Australia. So let us also acknowledge the traditional owners wherever you might be joining us from, and to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's now my great pleasure to introduce a very important member of Sovereign Hill's brilliant team, Chief of Content and Engagement, Katrina Nitsky, to say a few words. Thanks, Katrina.
Thank you, Ben. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I'm in Wathaurong country, and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land wherever you are. And I would like to welcome you all. I can see over 111 people. I think we have over 200 people registered for this virtual lecture. So it's amazing that people have made time to share their virtual space with us. We're delighted to see you all. I hope you're all cosy and safe, able to imagine yourselves at Sovereign Hill. As Ben said, our virtual Victoria Theatre looks full and rich, and I hope you're in for a really great evening tonight. This presentation is a really important event in Sovereign Hill's annual calendar. We've been hosting the lecture since 2010, generally to coincide with History Month, and to bring out a story in depth and with meaning that really is centred around the stories that Sovereign Hill shares. The lecture is named the Weston Bate Lecture. It marks, celebrates and honours the contribution that a really significant person has made to Sovereign Hill and our community in general. Professor Weston Bate has contributed enormous amount to the research and writing of local history, with particular reference to Ballarat and the goldfields. Ben's going to talk a little bit more about Professor Bate in a moment. I really want to acknowledge and thank the family for joining us today. It's important as a museum that we ground ourselves in the stories that come before. And as a museum with a mission that shares the stories of humanity to help us all adapt for a better future, I have to say there could be no better time than today, this year, for us to celebrate History Month with a story of a pandemic past. As we travel through this extraordinary time, I'm sure that there are lessons in the past for us, and I'm really looking forward to what Dr. Cousen has to share with us. I'm going to hand back to Ben in just a moment. I know you're all eager to get to the meat of our session today. But before I do, I want to acknowledge a really special person, Dr. Jan Croggan. I don't know, are you on screen, Jan? I can see you sitting cozy on your couch with Richard Croggan. Hello. I'm just going to take just a short moment to share and acknowledge the contribution that Jan has made to Sovereign Hill. She leaves Sovereign Hill in a week or two, and she's retiring to a life with her dogs, her family, her ballet and her opera after 41 years of really influencing Sovereign Hill and the story that we share, the environment that we create, and the experience we're able to offer more. I know that Ben has had a relationship with Jan for some time, and he may share a moment or two to celebrate Jan and her life. And I'm going to hand back over to Ben to give a few housekeeping notes and to introduce our speaker for tonight. And I'll leave it with you, Ben.
Thanks, Katrina. Ladies and gents, I know we're getting more and more familiar with these online ways of meeting and coming together at the moment. I'll talk a little bit more about the mechanics of how we'll handle the lecture and questions and so on in a moment. But just to let you know, our technical boffins behind the scenes have kindly muted our microphones for us, if you've noticed that happening. And just a reminder that the lecture tonight is being recorded. You can feel free to turn cameras off if you prefer, and turn them back on for the question session. But just a reminder to everyone that tonight's lecture will be recorded. Our colleague Kelly is going to make a link of the recording available that'll pop up in the chat at some stage. You can send Kelly an email and she'll be able to forward you the link. Okay, thanks again, Katrina. Let me just come back before I introduce our wonderful speaker tonight and say a few words about the man for whom this lecture is named, the late Professor Weston Bate. Now, Weston, as many of you will be aware, was one of Australia's leading historians with a particular expertise in local and urban history. His many influential works include his History of Brighton, my own personal favourite, Essential But Unplanned, a story of Melbourne's laneways. When I moved to Victoria, this basically taught me how to find my way around Melbourne. It's a wonderful book when we can all go back to the city. And of particular relevance for our topic tonight, of course, his wonderful history of the Victorian gold rushes and his landmark histories of Ballarat, Lucky City and life after gold. Weston's passion for researching and teaching Victoria's remarkable history shines through, I think, in all these works. At the University of Melbourne and then Deakin University, where he held the Foundation Chair in Australian Studies, Weston was known as a warm, challenging and inspiring teacher. Here at Sovereign Hill, where he served as consultant historian and where his work has been and really remains our primary historical reference, his memory is cherished with the deepest respect and I think the greatest affection too. The Weston Bate Memorial Lecture has now become an important Sovereign Hill tradition, as Katrina said, and after Weston's passing in 2017 is a continuing tribute to his work and his love of Ballarat history. The lecture strongly references the fact that Sovereign Hill is built on detailed historical research, which in turn enriches and develops the core experience of thousands of visitors to Sovereign Hill every year. Now, as Katrina said, Sovereign Hill is also deeply indebted to Weston's family for their ongoing support and their tireless encouragement over the years. And it gives me great pleasure tonight to acknowledge Mrs. Janice Bate and other members of the Bate family, including Rosie, Nicholas, Tristan, James, Christopher and Lyndon. And certainly when the situation here in Victoria allows, we'll look forward to welcoming the Bate family back to Sovereign Hill in person. I'd also like to thank, before we kick off tonight, the Sovereign Hill team who've worked so hard to make this evening possible, especially Kelly Bevan and Snez Kosick, and also, and I hope she'll forgive me too, Dr. Jan Croggan. Jan, who, as Katrina has just said, is about to head off on her well-earned retirement, has been part of Sovereign Hill since the late 1970s and has made an incredible contribution to the museum over 4 decades. Jan's passion and commitment for history at Sovereign Hill has been inspiring to us all, certainly to people like me who learned a lot of their young history at Sovereign Hill when they'd come and visit. And she's brought enthusiasm and professionalism to all her many roles over the years, including, of course, coordinating the Weston Bate lectures. So from all of us, a big thank you to Jan. Okay, just 2 final housekeeping points, folks, before I turn over to our speakers. After the lecture, we'll have some time for questions. Given the number of people we have in the audience tonight, we thought the best way to do this would be we'll collect questions in the chat down the bottom of the lecture. So as Nicola is going through, feel free to pop any questions in there. I'll do my best to be an articulate voice for you at the end, and we'll be able to come back to Nicola for some questions. And as I mentioned, Kelly will be able to provide a recording of the lecture if anyone is interested. Okay, my final task then, folks, before we kick off, is to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nicola Cousen. Dr. Cousen is a historian and consultant to the UNESCO Memory of the World program. Her research involves the history of Ballarat and of the medical care available during the city's first 2 decades, particularly in relation to the life of the Irish doctor and philanthropist, Dr. James Stewart. Dr. Cousen completed a PhD in history at Federation University in 2017 and has published some of her work in the Public Record Office of Victoria's journal, Provenance, if you're interested in reading a bit more after tonight. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me pass over to our 2020 Bate lecturer, Dr. Nicola Cousen, on the smallpox on Ballarat, 19th century public vaccination on the Victorian goldfields. Thanks very much, Nicola.
Thank you, Ben and Katrina, and to Jan Croggan and Kelly Bevan in the lead up to this lecture and to Sovereign Hill. I'll just share my screen now. Now, much of the research for this paper was completed prior to 2020, but with the events of this year, it's been surprising to see just how many similarities there are between this history and our present, from the way the disease spread to contact tracing and public health advances, but particularly in terms of human behaviour. It's made our current experiences a little easier to comprehend. Vaccination was considered a key factor in controlling smallpox infection in the event of an outbreak in Victoria during the 19th century. Its implementation was successful thanks to the efforts of public vaccinators and their medical colleagues, along with their powerful professional and local networks. Victoria was a leader in the Australian colonies in public health in terms of the comprehensive manner in which vaccination policy was implemented. A closer look at the experiences of Ballarat's public vaccinators during the 1850s and 1860s provides insight into public health issues that were distinctive to the goldfields, the way in which vaccination policy developed, and practices that were common to all public vaccinators throughout the colony. Public health issues on the Ballarat goldfields reflected the city's changing population during its first 2 decades. In the initial gold rush years, men far outnumbered women. Females represented only 24% of the 1854 Ballarat population, compared to 41% in Geelong and 44% in Melbourne. The leading causes of death in Victoria at this time were contagious diseases, and in areas outside of Melbourne, the highest mortality rates were caused by dysentery, typhoid, and phthisis. Ballarat was proclaimed a municipality in December 1855, and in July 1856, the Public Health Act of 1854 was extended to encompass the district. This enabled a local board of health to be established. When Ballarat East was proclaimed a municipality in May 1857, the former Ballarat municipality became known as Ballarat West. By 1861, the percentage of women in the Ballarat West population was nearly double the 1854 ratio of women to men and closer to equal at 44.8%. In Ballarat East, the percentage of women was 39.8%. As more women arrived and the goldfields population became more settled, the birth rate climbed, thus increasing the vulnerable, immunologically naive population. By 1861, children under the age of 10 constituted 30% of Ballarat West's population and 27% of Ballarat East's population. The leading cause of death continued to be contagious diseases. However, the number of children's illnesses and deaths became more prominent with these demographic changes. Childhood diseases and birth-related conditions joined gastroenteritis and diarrhoea as the leading causes of death in the district for 1863, followed by diphtheria. Other large contributors to the mortality rate were marasmus, which is the undernourishment of children, scarlatina, premature birth, protracted birth, malformation, and dentition, which is diarrhoea attributed to teething. Not only was there a larger infant population, but also new diseases introduced to this population could have a devastating effect, as was the case with diphtheria, which arrived in the colony in the late 1850s. Infections that survived the long voyage to Australia produced severe effects on the immunologically naive colonial-born population. There was no vaccination for diphtheria in Australia until the 20th century. However, the case was different with smallpox. The World Health Organization has described smallpox as one of the most devastating diseases known to humanity. Acutely contagious, it was transmitted by contact with infected people, and to a lesser extent, through contact with contaminated clothes and bedding. The disease entered the body through the respiratory tract and caused mouth and skin lesions. People became unwell 10 to 12 days after exposure to the disease and suffered fever, headache, myalgia, and vomiting. 2 or 3 days after the fever began, a characteristic rash developed that progressed to pustules, which turned to scabs and separated after 1 to 2 weeks. Some sufferers were able to recover. However, for many, the next stage was death. Smallpox was declared globally eradicated in 1980 and no longer occurs naturally. However, in the 19th century, it formed a very real threat to the well-being of the inhabitants of Victoria. Unvaccinated populations in which the disease had not previously existed were hit hardest. Its impact on the Aboriginal population was brutal. Richard Broome estimates that up to 60% of the exposed Aboriginal population in Victoria before the 1830s died from the disease. Devastation from the disease was also part of the collective memory of immigrants to the colony who had experienced it in their home countries. For example, during the 18th century, smallpox accounted for 8% of deaths in Sweden, Finland, and London, and 21% of deaths in Dublin. And Elizabeth Fenn suggests that a smallpox outbreak in North America from 1775 to 1782, which coincided with the American Revolution, took more lives than the war. Inoculation was introduced to England and Ireland as early as 1721 as a means of inducing immunity to smallpox. This helped to reduce the mortality rate from smallpox during the 18th century. However, historians are not in agreement of the extent of its effectiveness. Inoculation could be achieved by applying scabs or pus, which is called lymph, from an individual infected with smallpox to broken skin to develop a milder form of the disease and induce immunity. Smallpox is the variola virus, and this method was called variolation. In a modified form of inoculation, the lymph matter of humans or animals infected with cowpox was used. Cowpox is the vaccinia virus, and this was called vaccination. Variolation meant that patients had to endure a case of smallpox in an attempt to acquire immunity. By contrast, through vaccination, immunity might be acquired without suffering a case of the dreadful disease. Vaccination was generally introduced to the skin by piercing through a drop of vaccine, by rubbing vaccine into an incision, or by using a vaccine-charged instrument in one or multiple sites. The effectiveness of the vaccine depended on the potency, the virus strain, its preparation and storage conditions, and the extent of bacterial, fungal, and viral contamination from lymph harvested from live animals. 19th century Ireland provides an example of the success of vaccination in a country where smallpox was endemic, that is, constantly present in the population. Legislation was introduced to make vaccination free in 1851 and compulsory in 1863. The mortality rate from the disease dropped from 854 in 1864 to just 20 in 1869. Despite virtually identical legislation in Ireland and England, the compulsion to vaccinate was more successful in Ireland. This has been attributed to the work of medical practitioners. Medical practitioners were to play an important role in the success of vaccination in Victoria too. Vaccine lymph was transported to Australia on board ships through arm-to-arm transmission using human lymph. Human lymph was mostly used in Victoria before 1880, after which the use of calf lymph became more common. This was largely due to concerns about the transmission of childhood diseases and syphilis during the operation. Lymph was distributed to Victorian country areas on glass wrapped in moist paper and oiled silk by the Registrar General and later by the Chief Medical Officer. Vaccinators helped to determine how long the lymph remained effective through this distribution method as the practice developed in Victoria and as distribution methods improved. Vaccinators in Ballarat received their vaccine supplies from three sources: from government medical officials, from other doctors, and from the lymph taken from children they had vaccinated. Children were required to return to the vaccinator 8 days after the operation to check whether the vaccine had taken. During these visits, vaccinators issued vaccination certificates and took lymph for use in future vaccinations. Sometimes multiple attempts were required for a vaccination to take. Victoria developed differently to other Australian colonies due to the influx of highly educated middle-class immigrants during the gold rush and the expeditious establishment of institutions. The relative modernity of Victorian public health is reflected in the speed at which the colony adopted medical advances and legislation following changes in the United Kingdom. Victoria's Central Board of Health was established soon after its counterpart in England and Wales. This differs greatly from New South Wales, where the first Board of Health was not established until 1881, when public and political demand was spurred by a smallpox epidemic. Victoria established high-quality vital registration, some quite modern hospitals, and a medical society and journal by the 1860s. In contrast, New South Wales had no permanent professional medical association or journal until the 1880s. Ballarat followed the broad pattern of Victorian public health, but was also addressing the distinctive health needs of its goldfields community. By 1860, Ballarat's visionary pioneers had established many institutions, including a public hospital for miners and a benevolent asylum. Australian colonies followed different courses with their smallpox vaccination enforcement. Victoria enacted and enforced compulsory vaccination. Tasmania enacted similar legislation but failed to enforce it consistently, and New South Wales did not impose compulsory vaccination. Victoria's Compulsory Vaccination Act of 1854 followed the United Kingdom Vaccination Act of 1853, which mandated the vaccination of infants born in England or Wales. Under the 1854 Act, the colony was divided into 28 vaccination districts, with a public vaccinator appointed to each of these districts. By 1862, the number of public vaccinators had climbed to 144, reflecting the needs for disease control in the burgeoning population. As in Ireland, England and Wales, it became illegal to perform inoculations in Victoria, as inoculation kept the smallpox disease in circulation. Any medical practitioner legally qualified in the colony under the Medical Practitioners Act of 1854 could perform vaccinations, and this continued to be the case after public vaccinators were introduced. There were a few cases where lay people were made vaccinators for the districts where no registered medical practitioner was available, but this was problematic, brief, and not the practice in the majority of cases. This practice attracted strong opposition from the medical profession, with some doctors concerned that unqualified medical men appointed as vaccinators were misleading the public by falsely using the title of doctor. Doctors had to fight hard to protect their professional status as well as their incomes in the years prior to medicine's professionalisation in Victoria. The first public vaccinators in Ballarat were appointed in December 1854. They were Dr. James Williams at Ballarat and Dr. James Graham at Buninyong. Williams was soon replaced by Dr. James Stewart, who remained the public vaccinator for Ballarat until 1869. Public vaccinators were appointed in other parts of the district as the population grew. Reflecting Ballarat's melting pot of nationalities, they came from a range of countries and brought with them different levels of medical education, understanding and experience. The public vaccinator would vaccinate the majority of the children in their own district, but it was also common for other vaccinators to vaccinate children within the same district. Most extra vaccinators were from nearby areas, but some came from further afield. For example, Dr. Laurie was the public vaccinator for Learmonth in 1869, and along with local doctors Creelman and Fishbourne, he vaccinated the majority of children in the register. In the same register, there were also vaccinations performed by doctors from Creswick, Clunes, Talbot, Mortlake and Inglewood. During the 1850s and 1860s, Ballarat's public vaccinators were some of the leading doctors of the area. Men of influence in their community, many were popularly elected to honorary hospital and public positions. A number of them had travelled to Victoria as ship surgeons, and this formative experience influenced the goldfields medicine of Ballarat, as well as its civic development. This was because ship surgeons had many duties on board in addition to medical care. To maintain the health and well-being of passengers during their voyage, ship surgeons were responsible for controlling discipline, sanitation, and spaces on board the ship. Some Ballarat doctors, such as Dr. Stewart and Clendenning, were also municipal councillors, and thus were members of the local boards of health. Councillors sat as the local board of health at the end of council meetings, but health issues and correspondence from the central and local boards of health were also addressed during council meetings. It was through these local boards that the Central Board of Health effected its measures. There were just 5 local boards when sanitary administration began in Victoria in the 1850s. However, by 1871, this number had climbed to 106 local boards of health. The reach of public vaccinators extended well beyond their official role into a wide range of medical positions in the community. For example, the introduction of public vaccinators in Victoria coincided with measures of the newly formed Ballarat Medico-Chirurgical Society to protect the goldfields population from quacks. The first list of qualified practitioners was published in the Ballarat Star on the 1st of January 1855, the same day the Compulsory Vaccination Act took effect. The list also served to direct business to the listed doctors. Through forming professional groups, medical practitioners increased their power and status in the district and strengthened their networks, which enabled them to take on other public positions. Vaccination was embraced by many people in the Ballarat district. From the commencement of the Compulsory Vaccination Act in January 1855 to March 1861, 7,738 children were vaccinated in the district. Yet vaccination rates were never close to universal for Ballarat or for the entire colony, and not everybody conformed to vaccination laws. The public vaccinators could employ a variety of means to encourage people to vaccinate their children. Parents or guardians could be fined up to 40 shillings for the first offence and up to £5 for further offences if they failed to vaccinate their children or if they did not return after the required 8 days to check if the operation had been successful. In March 1861, Dr. Stewart took John Graver to court for not bringing his child back to check whether the vaccination had taken effect. Dr. Stewart did not wish to press charges. Instead, he used the occasion to remind the public that they had to comply with the Compulsory Vaccination Act. Strong networks and connections of the Ballarat doctors helped the vaccinators to influence public health. Many public vaccinators in Ballarat were also accoucheurs, doctors trained in midwifery, and as such could influence the vaccination of infants whom they had been the birth doctors. They worked closely with the Deputy Registrar for Ballarat, William Pooley, who regularly placed notices in the Ballarat newspapers, warning those who neglected registration and vaccination risked fines or imprisonment. Children were supposed to be vaccinated by 6 months of age, but sometimes older children were vaccinated for the first time with their younger siblings. Consequently, there were children of varying ages who were susceptible in the event of an outbreak. The Central Board of Health recommended the revaccination of adults who had not been vaccinated for over 10 years, particularly during times of suspected outbreaks. The vaccination registers held by the Public Records Office Victoria provide important insight into how closely vaccination policy was followed. The age of vaccinated people listed in the extant Ballarat district registers during the 1860s ranged from 5 weeks to 19 years of age. This indicates that most, if not all, of these vaccinations were first-time vaccinations and not the revaccination of adults. However, this is only an indication of vaccination practices, as the surviving registers are not complete for the district or for all years. Smallpox came to Victoria aboard immigrant ships during the 1850s. There were 14 cases of smallpox on the ship the Ocean Chief during its 1857 voyage to Victoria. The ship was held in quarantine off Point Nepean after its arrival in Port Phillip. About 340 passengers were removed to the sanitary station under the control of the Chief Medical Officer. By waiting for no more infections to occur, the disease was prevented from entering the colony. This was despite a failed attempt by the more affluent saloon passengers to be excused from quarantine. 3 months later, however, the disease circumvented quarantine measures and resulted in 3 deaths. The infection was spread by 3 passengers from the Commodore Perry ship, which arrived at Port Phillip Heads in September 1857 from Liverpool. According to the Central Board of Health, it was through the willful concealment of the presence of the disease and an attempt to evade quarantine laws that infected passengers were allowed off the ship. It took 18 days for new suspected cases to appear in the Melbourne and Gisborne areas. It became apparent that the disease could spread in the colony away from the original outbreak site, as carriers may not have known they had the disease due to its asymptomatic incubation period. When suspected cases appeared in the neighbourhood of Lonsdale and Spencer Streets in Melbourne a few weeks after the ship's arrival, the Central Board of Health considered that vaccination of all children and adults who had not previously been vaccinated would be a sufficient precaution against the spread of the disease. Dr. William McRae was the Chief Medical Officer of Victoria, the President of the Central Board of Health, and As a British naval surgeon, he was a strong advocate for vaccination. During the 1857 suspected outbreak, he experienced resistance and opposition when trying to implement the board's sanitary measures. In October 1857, a young member of the Kirk family of Jeffcott Street was suspected of suffering from the disease, and Dr. McRae ordered for the child to be removed to Royal Park. His colleague Dr. Knaggs failed to follow his request to vaccinate the sibling of the child. Instead, Dr. Knaggs informed the children's father that removal of the infected child to quarantine in Royal Park was optional, and he wrote to the newspapers, adding to the public fear and misunderstandings of procedures. Dr. McRae considered that Dr. Knaggs did everything in his power to thwart the sanitary precautions of the Central Board of Health. The parents eventually agreed to have their child removed. However, the child died within a few hours of reaching Royal Park. Immediately after the child's removal, Dr. McRae ordered that the Kirk family's clothes and bedding be put through boiling water, and that their home be cleansed with boiling water and the walls and floors washed with diluted chloride of zinc solution. This followed the Public Health Act, which allowed for orders to cleanse, purify, ventilate, and disinfect houses, buildings, churches, and places of assembly. Dr. McRae's attempt to vaccinate the second child failed, and another life was lost to the disease. Conditions particular to the goldfields caused additional complications. In 1858, drainage issues in Ballarat concerned the local and central boards of health. Debris from puddling and sluicing operations, known as sludge, filled watercourse beds, encroached on the roads, damaged property, and interfered with drainage. In the event of a smallpox outbreak, the cleansing and disinfecting of a house or tent of an infected person would be impaired by lack of drainage and by the contaminated liquids waiting to evaporate. Ground pollution from privy cesspits could also spread disease. Privies at the Ballarat railway station were flushed into the Yarraway Creek throughout the 1860s, and there was a special channel for the flushing of the city's hospital, bank, and hotel closet cesspools. It was not until 1872 that the city's local Board of Health began a zealous campaign to convert over 4,000 privies to the earth closet system and somewhat address this problem. In the wake of the smallpox outbreak in Melbourne, a suspected outbreak occurred in Ballarat that exemplifies the fear and confusion about smallpox in Australia and the varied opinions of doctors. In a situation similar to what we are currently facing, where without a test, it's unclear if an infection is a common cold, the flu, or COVID-19, there was confusion as to whether a case was smallpox, chickenpox, or a form of smallpox modified after vaccination. In April 1858, an 8-year-old girl, Miss Lecky, was suspected to have contracted the disease. Dr. Allison had been attending her and considered her conical-shaped pustules to be an aggravated case of chickenpox. Dr. Richardson had vaccinated Lecky a year earlier and believed that she was suffering from malignant smallpox, as she was covered in pustules of various stages. In the belief that smallpox was a consequence of ignorance and filth, and despite vaccinating some of his patients, Dr. Richardson was in favour of sanitary measures over vaccination. Not everyone shared his beliefs. On being notified of the case, Central Board of Health President Dr. McRae requested authority to extend the Public Health Act to encompass Ballarat East, and for the Chief Secretary's Department to incur whatever expense was required to prevent the spread of the disease. Dr. McRae also called for an investigation by the public vaccinator for Ballarat, Dr. Stewart, and the honorary medical officers of the Ballarat Hospital, who concluded that the girl had the less dangerous cowpox and not smallpox. The Star newspaper misreported the case in an alarmist manner, suggesting that Dr. Allison was disgracefully derelict in his duty and that he had placed the community at risk of the virulent infectious disease. A pitiable apology was given the following day. The newspaper expressed regret for having caused unnecessary alarm. If they'd made a mistake, which they were not convinced they had, they were in the company of medical professionals who could not agree. The Star was entirely unhelpful and continued trying to undermine the public vaccinator and other doctors. even recommending that 60 or 70 children who attended Miss Lecky's school should stay at home. The public vaccinator, Dr. Stewart, condemned the spread of false reports, explaining that had he and his colleagues not investigated the case, the Lecky family's tent and bedding would have been needlessly destroyed. If the doctors, and particularly the public vaccinator, had not been so well trusted by the public, the newspapers could have stirred up vigilantes to do more than just burn the family's tent and belongings. During the 1857 Melbourne outbreak, lodgers who shared a house with a patient suspected of having smallpox were inclined to remove him by any means. The chief medical officer had to intervene and find an appropriate place for the sick man's care and isolation from the rest of the community. In actions reflecting those of the Ballarat district public vaccinators, Dr. McRae felt that he was bound by common humanity to provide for the patient in some way, and he adopted the only means at his disposal. Early attempts to obtain a vaccination office for Ballarat East before the suspected outbreak in 1857 had failed, despite Dr. Clendenning's concern that it was really too much for delicate females to undergo the long journey through the mud of the main road up to the Weston township. Rather than out of concern for the poor delicate females, Dr. Clendenning's motives were more business-oriented. With the population and birth rate increasing, female and child patients were important contributors to a doctor's livelihood, and much business was being directed towards the doctors of Ballarat West. After the 1857 suspected outbreak, Dr. Lemand was appointed Ballarat East's first public vaccinator. During the 1860s, public vaccinators continued to play an important part in the prevention of smallpox through vaccination and in calming public fears. Dr. Stewart, Nicholson and Holthouse were called to consult in a suspected smallpox case at the Ballarat Benevolent Asylum in November 1862. The female patient had thick papular eruptions on her face, arms and body, which became pustular. The doctors examined her and all agreed that it was not smallpox. Other suspected outbreaks in the colony continued to heighten fear of the disease. Another smallpox outbreak began in Melbourne in 1868. The disease had again breached quarantine measures through passengers from the ship the Avonvale. This outbreak lasted 6 months and involved 43 verified cases. The ship's chief mate died from smallpox in the immigration hospital, along with a patient sharing his ward. Suspected cases reported in the hospital neighbourhood were determined to be chickenpox. An article in the Australian Medical Journal suggested that some cases were incorrectly diagnosed as smallpox because the people involved had an inordinate craving after notoriety. A commission was appointed to investigate the outbreak, and its 9 medical practitioners were divided in opinion. 2 thought the cases were true smallpox, 3 thought they were smallpox modified by vaccination, and 4 believed that it was not smallpox at all. This lack of consensus added to the public's confusion and alarm. Victorians were kept aware of the harsh reality of smallpox through newspaper reports of its endemic and intermittent states overseas, along with mortality rates. There was a good deal of scaremongering which could be detrimental, but it could also be beneficial, and suspected outbreaks were so significant that they contributed to large improvements in the development of public health. For example, the prevalence of the disease in Mauritius in 1854 prompted Dr. McRae to organise a vaccine facility in Melbourne. The medical community used newspapers and journals to administer the Compulsory Vaccination Act, to implement precautionary public health messages and measures, and to dispel harmful myths and misinformation. Reports on court cases provided fear of punishment for not vaccinating. Heightened fear from news of suspected outbreaks served to increase vaccination rates, especially when people had been lax, as had been the case in Melbourne. The Central Board of Health used the prevalence of smallpox in London in July 1863 to encourage parents to vaccinate their children. According to the Star newspaper, the response in Ballarat was so great that the footpath outside the public vaccinator's office in Armstrong Street was rendered almost impassable with women and children, and the vaccinator's supply of lymph ran out. The newspaper also reported that Ballarat's deputy registrar was taking out summonses against those who neglected to vaccinate their children, thus combining the fear of disease with the fear of financial loss to achieve the desired effect. The Central Board of Health began to admit reporters to their meetings in early 1869, but public health in Ballarat was more transparent and accessible to the public, as local Board of Health meetings were always reported in the Star newspaper as part of municipal council proceedings. Victoria's two greatest protections from outbreaks of smallpox were its isolation from countries where smallpox existed and vaccination. As the 1857 and 1868 experiences reveal, immigration medical checks and quarantine measures were not a perfect barrier to the disease. The Central Board of Health considered extensive vaccination to be the only means of rendering such a visitation as harmless as possible, as it secured comparative immunity from the disease. The Ballarat public vaccinators provided their goldfields population with a means of securing comparative immunity from smallpox. They provided the knowledge and advice to allay fears, diagnosis of suspected cases, and the care of the community through their medical and civic roles. By such means, they earned the trust of their community, which in turn prevented fear from turning into panic and vigilantism. These doctors had high status in their community, and the role of public vaccinator added to this status. As this talk has shown, public health in Ballarat reflects the larger pattern of Victorian public health, which differed from other Australian colonies. However, it also diverged from this pattern, and its doctors adapted to the distinctive goldfields conditions, networks, and demography. Vaccination was a key factor for controlling smallpox infection in the event of an outbreak in Victoria during the 19th century, and its implementation was successful thanks to the efforts of the public vaccinators, the central and local boards of health, their medical colleagues, and their powerful professional and local networks. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicola, for a wonderful paper, and one that I think is so timely when we're all focused on questions of disease control and quarantine, the way in which the press are reporting what's going on, thinking about the efficacy of vaccines. Really, all these questions seem so central to our day-to-day lives at the moment. So really fascinating historical perspective for us. Thanks so much, Nicola. We do have some time for questions, folks. A couple of people have got in and posted a few already. So what I'll do, I'll keep monitoring the chat. If you have a question you'd like to ask, feel free to pop it in the chat, and I'll deliver it on your behalf. What I might do, Nicola, I'll give you a chance to have a quick cup of tea there just to catch your breath. We might start with a question from Margaret Anderson. And Margaret asks, given the devastating impact of smallpox on First Nations people was well known before the gold rush, were they included in the vaccination effort?
The records that I've seen don't distinguish who was given it or not. So I don't have an adequate answer to that question. But it's a great question.
Thanks, Nicola. Thank you. I'll move on then to one from Anne Begsunter. Anne asks a question I was thinking about, actually. Given the number of quacks on the goldfields in the 1850s, how could people have confidence in the doctors who are given responsibility for vaccination? It seems like there's a lot of uncertainty around medical knowledge.
I think they gain confidence in a number of ways. So with their public roles, their different civic roles, there were just a lot of those doctors were quite prominent in the community. So they already had sort of the reputations, and the vaccinators were the ones with the higher reputations and also of a higher class in those roles. Yeah.
And so they did a good job of discrediting any quacks who were around then.
Certainly. And after in the 1860s, when a Medical Registration Act came in, you could only use the title of doctor if you were registered as a doctor. So if you trained as a physician, you could only work as a physician, you couldn't work as a surgeon as well. So a lot of the doctors had to get more training if they wanted to practice as both. And that ruled out other people from using the title of doctor, because before that, people who hadn't even trained in medicine were using the title.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nicola. I'll just move on. We've got some praise there in the chat, so thank you for your kind comments, everybody. I'll just move on. Our next question there is from Claire Jeffersoni, and Claire asks, was the vaccine made locally or imported? Did heat or the condition that the vaccine was kept in make any difference as to how successful it was?
Yes, that's a great question. So it came to Australia through arm-to-arm transmission. So somebody that was infected, they take some pus from their infection, and that would be what would be put into the arm of the next person. So it's imported as it came out on the ship with the people, but it was local. So the public vaccinators would take new lymph from their own patients. Somebody that they just vaccinated would go to the next person. So it was quite fresh, but yes, without refrigeration or anything in the heat, you wouldn't really want to be getting that. So yeah, lots of things about the condition it was stored in would affect it. But also public vaccinators, if they used bad lymph, they risked 12 months jail. So it was in the interests of the doctors to make sure they had good quality lymph.
Okay, thanks, Nicola. Fantastic. Our next question is from Jen Fernie-Howe. And Jen asks, in the slide towards the end of the smallpox scare, the illustration in the top right corner shows 3 people in white robes being ushered into a tent. Do we have any idea who was wearing these PPE, or well, 19th century PPE outfits? Were they health workers or patients or perhaps religious figures?
It's a great question. They were the doctors, so that is the PPE of the time. And that was from a later outbreak in Hamilton. I think it's the 1870s or 1880s. But yes, they were well covered up in their PPE, going to check on the patients.
Okay, fantastic. We've got a bit more praise in the chat, and I know our audience will be very keen to go and read a bit more of your work, perhaps in your provenance article after tonight. I just wondered if, just while people are formulating questions, I mean, I learned so much from your talk just about the way in which Victoria seems to be much more modern than maybe we imagine. It seems that, you know, you imagine sort of gold rush Victoria being very chaotic, but it seems that very quickly sort of quite modern medical procedures and ideas are imported to Victoria.
Yes, in the mid-19th century is when medicine was becoming scientific. So the younger doctors were coming with the latest medical training, and they were, because they were doing the civic roles as well, they were just amazing, the first early pioneers on the goldfields. So they achieved quite a lot. And they also kept up to date because periodicals would come out on the ships with each ship. So they'd have the latest information from Europe, and different practices were picked up quickly, like the use of chloroform that started being used in 1847, and it was in Australia within a year. Both ether and chloroform were used for anaesthesia. So yeah, things moved quickly at that time.
Fascinating. Thanks, Nicola. We've got a question from Elise Burke. Elise is asking, were needles used in vaccinations in this period? I suppose, what's the mechanics of administering the treatment?
So they would either put like a bubble of the lymph or pus on the person's skin and pierce it with a needle so that it would go through the skin, or they would cut the skin with their lancets, and later on with scarificators, so a little machine that would sort of cut the skin with a click, press a button, and it would do multiple points of the skin. So, yeah.
Thanks, Nicola. We'll just wait for one last round of questions. Just while we do, could I just ask you to talk a little bit more about the ship's surgeons? They were clearly very important to the story. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the importance of the ship surgeons when they arrive in Victoria.
Well, when they've travelled out, they've had the unique experience of quarantine for a number of months. So they got to watch how diseases developed. If people were sick at the start of the voyage, they'd have months to watch what happens, and they were in control of the people on board. So they were the doctors, the magistrates, the just in charge of controlling the spaces on board ship. So they actually learnt quite well how to deal with the public with complete control over them. So it was very good training for when they came to do jobs like municipal councillors and just on the goldfields with a new community, setting it up as pioneers.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got a couple more questions. One from Emma, who asked, do we know much about nurses or midwives in terms of administering the vaccines or in their other roles on the goldfields?
At this stage, it was doctors doing it. There's no mention of nurses, and the doctors also did midwifery as well. So it's more just the male doctors at this point. And if there are women involved, they don't get a mention.
Okay, thanks, Nicola. The questions are coming in furiously now, so bear with me, folks. I'm keeping up as best I can here. A question from Jonathan Bate. When was a test developed for smallpox rather than sort of relying on symptoms?
Well, I know there's the tests now that can check for it, but the last known case of variola minor, so the less deadly version of smallpox, that was in 1977 in Somalia, they still misdiagnosed it. The male that had it, they thought he had malaria, then they diagnosed it as chickenpox, and then finally as smallpox. So there are tests in more recent times, but it's sort of, because it's not naturally occurring, there's not people to test on as much. So those sorts of things are more modern, the tests.
Okay, great, thank you. Got another question from Celeste, who asks a really interesting question. Given how infectious the disease was, what was the approach to disposing of people who passed away from it in Ballarat or more broadly?
Well, that's a great question, and they don't mention that at all with it. Like there's no mention of special ways to dispose of them. So I'm not sure whether they went to any special trouble or not.
Thanks, Nicola. Next up, we've got a question from Rod Unmac. Rod asks, given that the smallpox, the lymph from those infected was applied to lesions as part of the treatment, how often did it progress to full-blown smallpox instead of just providing the sort of mini case you wanted to develop immunity?
Because they're being vaccinated with cowpox, it never went to smallpox from the vaccination. It went to a case of cowpox, so the less troublesome cowpox.
And Rod also asks, what percentage of the public who caught smallpox survived, if we know, roughly?
Sorry, what was that?
Do we know what percentage of people survived when they caught smallpox at the time?
It was for the minor version of it. It was 1% died, and for the more deadly version, it was 30% of people died.
Okay. We've got a question next from Christine Seargart, who asks, were most smallpox patients housed in their homes or were they accommodated in hospital? Which feels like a very much a 2020 sort of question, Christine. Were people housed at home when they contracted it or were they put into hospital?
That's a great question. They were housed at home. The hospital in Ballarat, which opened in the mid-1850s, was purely a surgical hospital. Some sick people were admitted, but mostly not. And so for the 1850s and 60s, most sick people and children were cared for at home.
Thanks, Nicola. And then a question from, sorry, I don't have a name. It's from CG to all of us. And CG asks about germ theory in the period. So saying from memory, germ theory still wasn't widespread in the 1860s. So did complications arise from things like the reuse of contaminated equipment and so on?
Yeah, germ theory, it was a bit later. I mean, there were sort of types of germ theory at that time, but they did take precautions for different things, like with puerperal fever, the childbed fever, they knew that it was important to wash their hands, like with the theories of Semmelweis, and even like at the Rotunda Hospital in Ireland, they knew to change the sheet or wash the sheets after women had given birth, and then they would burn the straw of the mattresses and things. So they certainly had ideas at that time of being careful and washing their hands and taking precautions before the full germ theory was known later.
Thanks, Nicola, and thanks for being so gracious in fielding our barrage of questions. We're approaching 8 o'clock, folks, so that might be a good time for us to draw proceedings to a close. I'd just like to pass on a very kind message from Jonathan Bate. Thank you, Jonathan. Just passing on the Bate family's thanks and delight for a brilliant lecture and discussion. I'd like to acknowledge Miss Janice Bate there as well. From me, what I'd like to do is just to thank Nicola for a wonderful lecture and for taking our questions tonight, to thank the team at Sovereign Hill for organising everything and making this possible, as they always do so well, to thank you for being such a wonderful audience, everybody, and for joining us in these unusual times. We'll look forward to having a Bate lecture in person in some stage in the not too distant future, we hope. And I'd also just like to again thank the Bate family for their ongoing support and commitment to this event. It really means a great deal to everyone at Sovereign Hill. Finally, I might just pass back to Katrina to give her the final word. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Bate family.
I also would like to express my thanks to Dr. Nicola Cousen, to the Bate family, to Ben for, as always, hosting an extraordinarily interesting presentation and helping us find the answers to those questions that we all have. As so many of the comments have said, this is incredibly timely. I cannot imagine a more timely topic for us to talk about. Of the lessons of the past are truly with us today. You know, so many of us can see ourselves in this experience and understanding that this isn't fresh. We're experiencing it in a different way, perhaps. There are obviously many more technological solutions to life today, but those fundamental fears, challenges, innovation, the way that we live, the way that we draw together is so much what Sovereign Hill is about. So thank you all for coming together to share the story, even if we're in our virtual room. We cannot wait. I cannot express the heartfelt emotion that I say, please, cannot wait until we can welcome you back to Sovereign Hill. As you all know, we open to the public on October 31. Numbers are very limited for a little while, but we can't wait to see people back sharing the stories of humanity, understanding how that past is resonant today. And we're all adapting to work for a better future. So thank you again, my thanks to the Bate family, my thanks to Ben and to Dr. Nicola Cousen. And we'll see you all back at Sovereign Hill.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.